Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today. I'm excited to have Jeff Stassi, Muriel Weintraub, and Grace Bangdong here with me today hosting the webinar. I am Amy Knock, and I will be moderating today's session. Before we begin, I'll let you know a little bit more how the webinar will run. The webinar is being recorded, and the slides and recording will be available to you within 3 business days. A short Q&A session will follow the presentation today to answer any viewers submitted questions. During the webinar, you can submit questions you have using the webinar sidebar menu. Select the questions tab, type in your question, then hit the enter key on your keyboard. Remember, you can submit questions anytime throughout the webinar. That concludes my very brief introduction. Jeff, I will now pass it over to you. You may begin your presentation.
Thank you, Amy. I appreciate the intro, and welcome everybody to our webinar, Risks and Challenges with Plant-Based Cosmetics and Dietary Supplements. I will begin the presentation and I'll pass it off to Marielle and then to Grace. We'll have our own topics here. We'll focus a little bit on different things. My presentation will be a kind of a high-level overview of the markets and talking a bit about designing specifications, some risks and challenges in these markets as well. So next slide, please, Amy or Grace. Thank you. Advancing. Apologize, a little technical difficulty here. All right, here we go. Sorry about that slight delay. So I'll give a little high-level perspective here. Next slide. So just to give you kind of a preview of what we've seen and what the industries are showing, the botanical, as far as plant-based ingredients go, the botanical supplement market and the natural and organic cosmetic markets are really rapidly growing. We've seen that over the last several years, and we see no indication of that slowing down over the next, several years, half decade for sure. Right now, the botanical supplement market about $32.5 billion. Of course, that's the worldwide market for botanicals. The bigger supplement market is much bigger than that. 150 billion is projected to be as well. So as you see, there is a lot of popularity with natural-based products, botanicals in the industry, and with that, with a lot of the growth comes some challenges for each industry that can introduce a lot of risk with the products. So I'll start to discuss a little bit about that as my presentation moves on. Next slide. So there are many challenges to ingredient and product integrity, as we know. Pressures on ingredient supply chain, as you know, with COVID and a lot of the, over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of pressures on ingredients and the supply chain slowdowns, things like that. So that puts a lot of pressure on, obtaining ingredients, which can cause some risk and certain things that may, be introduced into your supply. So be careful on the way you're purchasing things along those lines. There is a low barrier to entry, which increases risks, of course, for unsafe products to infiltrate the market. A lot of new players in the market trying to, take advantage of some of those, the growth that we've seen in the industry. So that also poses some challenges to the industry as well. Controlling contamination can be difficult, as I'm sure you all know. There is a worldwide availability for online resources, which creates kind of a low barrier to entry, I would say. Getting these products sold around the world is pretty straightforward, pretty simple. So a lot of perhaps unsafe products, bad products, poor products are being, sold out there. So those are some of the other challenges we've seen. As we all know, there's no pre-market safety data required to sell products. That also poses some challenges and risks. And as we talk about natural plant-derived ingredients, they're easily adulterated. There's a lot of, adulteration going on in the market there. So I'll talk about that as we move forward as well. Next slide. As we all know, bad ingredients equals bad products. This is, nothing new, of course. So you want to take a look at that and make sure, I guess one of my recommendations, make sure you're purchasing and utilizing good quality ingredients from trusted suppliers. That can really reduce the amount of risk you have, especially as you manufacture products and start to develop finished products. You don't want all those contaminants, adulterants cascading into the product in the end. So what we should always recognize is to use a risk management approach when we're dealing with ingredient qualifications, things like that. So I know Grace will talk a little bit more about that in her presentation as far as risk assessments and those types of things. So I'll just do a really brief overview here. One thing to do is to identify risks and assess the degree. So, perhaps identify them as low, medium, and high risk. I would say high risk ingredients are likely to present safety issues in the product. So those would be high risk type of factors. So trying to prioritize those types of things is something I would definitely recommend as a way to approach ingredients and ingredient supply. Also, the type of risk, is it a quality risk? Is it a regulatory risk? And as I mentioned, a safety risk really pose big problems in the industry. So looking at the ingredient supply and how that might transpire to the finished product is something you should all be focusing in on. And then there's also factors that are involved. The supplier, if you're changing suppliers, that will pose risks as well. You want to trust your supplier, but you also want to make sure they're doing the right thing for you. Next slide, please, Grace. That brings me to adulteration. I know that this term has been out there, of course, and want to make sure we all understand what this is meaning. There are a couple of types of adulteration. One is unintentional adulteration, and the other is intentional adulteration. With regards to safety, and this is really where the key factors come in. You'll see a common theme between us all discussing, safety factors and risk assessments and things. So we're really kind of focusing in on the safety aspect of the products here. So with regards to safety, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act defines adulterated dietary supplements as one that contain dietary ingredient that present risk to health when used as recommended, can contain an NDI that lack information on established safety, contain ingredients to pose an imminent hazard to health, and has been manufactured under conditions that do not follow current GMP. So any of that could be considered adulteration. Next slide. I do really want to focus on intentional adulteration. This is really where the FDA is focusing in on things that are infiltrating the ingredient supply. So intentional adulteration is generally something that's economically motivated. It takes the form most of the time in substituting less expensive ingredients for the more expensive ingredients. So you'll see that. I'll have an example of that as I move here. And it's also to elicit a pharmaceutical response. You'll add, ingredient that may, for weight loss, you'll add sibutramine or fluoxetine, those types of compounds that, have some efficacy to make that work, which are not legal in these dietary supplements or cosmetic products as well. US FDA is tainted the supplement database. Sorry, I have a typo here. It should say 2007 to 2021. There were 1,068 unique supplements adulterated with active pharmaceutical ingredients. So that's a big problem in the industry that the FDA is focusing on, especially in the sexual and weight management as well. So, and I do want to give one example that we probably all remember this from back in 2007, the melamine crisis, where melamine caused the death of 6 infants back during that time. And this was a big, one of the more famous economically motivated adulteration scandals that we've seen, where they used melamine to boost the nitrogen level in the infant formula, which as a compound, this chemical compound is very dangerous. And of course it did lead to some deaths. So that was one of the more famous examples of this. So really be prepared to understand what adulterations are, and especially in the line with intentional adulteration. Sometimes it will infiltrate your ingredients and you won't even know it. So control over the ingredients you have is very important. Next slide. Here is a list of some plant botanicals at risk of adulteration. This is a kind of a subset of lists that I've seen out in the industry. Turmeric, one of the bigger plant-based nutrient ingredients that are out there on the market today, is very highly adulterated, using yellow dyes to enhance the color, using other curcuma species to pass that off as the curcuma longa species. So that is a highly adulterated product. Saw palmetto, this is highly recognized as an ingredient that's adulterated quite often with cheaper plant oils like palm oil. Cordyceps, grapeseed extract, high in proanthocyanidins, which are found in cheaper ingredients. Black cohosh is a highly adulterated plant. So as you can see, there are lists of these kind of plants that you need to recognize, and when designing specifications around these things, understanding where some of these adulterations may fall. Next slide. So contamination, a little bit different definition than adulteration. Contamination is the presence of unwanted components in a product that may pose a risk to safety. Contamination comes in different forms. There is chemical contamination, example, pesticides, residual solvents. Those are chemicals that can contaminate a product where you want to make sure you can control and understand where those risk factors may lie. Also microbiological contaminants, pathogens, other bacterial sources. You know, we're obviously talking a little bit about plant materials today, which do pose a risk in a lot of these categories, especially chemical, using solvents to extract some of the plants. Microbiological, as these are natural compounds, can inherently carry bacterial type of bacterial contaminations into the product. There are environmental, where heavy metals can infiltrate the product as well. Dioxins, PCBs, those types of things that might come from the environment that you should recognize as well. Physical contamination with filth, extraneous matter, things that you might see, insect fragments that might infiltrate as well into the product. So those types of things are common contaminants that you may see. And also allergenic, you know, if there's things that are cross contact, may introduce allergens that are unwanted in the product as well. So just a few categories to realize that you may have to look at to make sure that those things are taken care of. One of the big things I do want to focus on, and this probably, you know, I can't underemphasize this enough, is setting proper specifications for plant-based ingredients. This is, you know, since 2009, I'm going to read my notes here. Since 2009, inaccurate or lack of specifications has been the #1 FDA warning letter that's been out there. So this has been out there since, you know, for the last dozen years. Not sure why this has been so, you know, such a unrealized thing in the industry. So setting proper specifications, designing proper specifications into the product, especially at the ingredient level, is something, you know, that's very important and a big focus of the FDA as well. So set specifications based on the type of contaminants that may adulterate or lead to adulteration of the finished product. Again, use a risk management approach. I won't get into that too much, as I talked about that a bit earlier. Also, for setting specifications, identity of the plant-based ingredient is a required specification along with other things. But in this case, identity is a very important piece of this. You really want to scrutinize and plan for the plant-based ingredient you had. I showed you a list of some common ingredients that are adulterated. So pre-planning, looking at the ingredients that you're using, making sure that you understand the identity of that material, you know, and of course, a lot of these things can be passed off as, you know, the misidentified, I would say, by laboratories and other other entities that may be looking at that are difficult to handle. So make sure you have proper identity specifications designed around your products. And again, a high likelihood to introduce heavy metals with these natural products. So, you know, if you're selling in California, you have Prop 65 to deal with, those types of regulations. So understanding where heavy metals might come into play as well, and design specifications around that within your ingredients and your products. And of course, microbiology is a big piece of that as well. Next slide. This is a table from the American Herbal Products Association. A lot of these trade associations do a great job of keeping the industry informed, aligned with some of the, you know, the limits and things like that. So this document has been out there since, I believe, 2014. Shows you a bit about the microbial limits of botanical ingredients. As you can see from different organizations, how they align, how they maybe perhaps don't align. But this is a good resource for you to use and can be found on the OPPA site or even on the internet as well. So I would use this if you're looking at trying to establish ingredient limits and specifications for botanical ingredients. Next slide. And the finished product botanicals, this is a similar table, a little bit different context from the results side, but also a good reference to look at when you're looking at limits for microbials in your finished product botanical. Next slide, please. And the next couple slides here to end my presentation are just a couple of examples of what I've seen for warning letters in the herbal space. This one in particular, as you can read, this is a warning letter, excerpt from a warning letter that discusses a bit about spirulina powder that's been a popular ingredient over the years, using a microscopic examination and, you know, the inappropriateness, I guess, that this auditor had in using that technique to identify the genus and species of these materials. So again, I guess point being is use the proper methodology, assign the proper specifications, and you won't get a warning letter like I see in this case. Next slide. And this is a popular one. I've had discussions with customers around these types of issues, and now I see it in the warning letter that I found, is that, you know, sometimes, you know, in dealing with plant materials, you know, in trying to identify those materials, you don't have proper references, you haven't completely vouchered the specimens that you're going to compare against. And some folks have gone to, you know, just comparing the spectrum perhaps of the next lot of plant material to the previous one, which is what this warning letter says is not to be done, since the original plant material was never fully qualified. So those are things that should be a no-no when we're dealing with, you know, aligning specifications with proper methodology. So I just wanted to put those out there, that there are these types of examples in plant-based herbs that you may want to be aware of. Next slide. And to conclude my part of the presentation, of course, use a risk-based approach to plant-based ingredients. Again, plant-based ingredients, like perhaps chemical ingredients, pose additional risks, additional factors that you may have to, you know, take considerations of. Safety is the most critical risk factor. So if you have a budget to work under, you're constrained a bit, you know, deal with the highest priority, the highest risk factors first, and then move from there. Design meaningful specifications. Again, I can't stress that enough. This is the #1 cited issue with FDA over the last decade or 12 years. Use good quality ingredients. Good quality ingredients oftentimes make good final products. So the better the ingredients you're using, the better specifications, the better designed program you have, the better chance you have of creating a good quality, safe product. And understand likely contaminants and adulterants. Again, this is not always intuitive. The ingredients have to be dealt with kind of one at a time individually. So understanding where those risks lie and what the adulterants and contaminants are is something that should always be focused on. And that will conclude my portion of the presentation. Could I get the next slide, please? Go here, I will, thank you. And so I would like to introduce the next speaker for this, this webinar, Trends, Regulatory Updates, and Risks for Botanical-Based Products. I'd like to introduce Marielle Weintraub, who's the Analytical Service Manager here at Eurofins, and I'm going to pass this off to Marielle. Marielle?
Excellent. Thanks, Jeff. I appreciate the introduction. As Jeff said, my name is Marielle Weintraub. So today I'm going to be going over some of the newest trends found in botanical-based products such as supplements and cosmetics, as well as some regulatory updates that we have received from FDA. Next slide, please. So as Jeff had mentioned, the botanical supplement market size is rather large. So for 2022, it was at 55.6 billion, and that forecast for 2032 is to be up in the $116 billion range. So looking for reasons why. Why does it have this type of growth? Why are consumers really interested in these type of products? And I found a quote from an analyst at Future Market Insights, and I completely agree with their point of view. And it really is a customer's inclination looking for clean label supplements. This is alongside a new and refocused view on a healthy lifestyle. So we will continue to see this kind of growth as we see more manufacturers innovating and combining botanical supplements, focusing on things like functionality and strength. Next slide, please. So when we're looking at these trends, I like to divide them into two sections. We're going to look at some categories, and then we're going to look at some very specific compounds. So when we're looking at the newest up-and-coming category trends, we saw a huge increase in sleep support ingredients, an even larger increase when it came to immune health ingredients, which had to do with us being much more concentrated on health during a pandemic. Interestingly, we have always seen growth in adaptogens, but they have really started to take off and be combined into other categories. When I'm talking about adaptogens, I'm talking about things like mood support, cognitive support, and types of products that reduce stress. Another big winner has been beauty from within, such as collagen. And as we're talking about innovation, the idea of products that have dual health benefits. So combining things like sleep support with an adaptogen to reduce stress. And another big winner that we have seen is when you give people options. So when you're giving consumers alternative dosage formats. So you're giving things that are easy to take, that are pleasing to take. We have seen continuous growth with gummies, and then we've seen a lot of fizzy drink mixes come out, and then the tried and true capsules are still a big winner when it comes to these dietary supplement trends. So on the next slide, we're going to go over more of these compounds that we're seeing. So when we're talking about sleep, we have seen a very large increase in the use of melatonin. When we're talking about the immune products, there was a very large order and use of elderberry. We've seen more mushroom products come to market, as well as people using things like echinacea and oregano. As I mentioned before, the adaptogens are being added in alongside these more traditional categories, as well as being sold on their own. But you have things like adaptogens that are ashwagandha and rhodiola. Both deal with the reduction of stress, which is why they are under that adaptogen category. But rhodiola is used to increase energy and strength, mental capacity, and people are using ashwagandha to help calm the brain, reduce pressure, things like that. And then the beauty from within category, collagen, has really taken off alongside something called NAC, N-A-C. So when we're talking about these trends, we really do have these commonly used products, and then we have some of these almost lightning in a bottle trends. So on the next slide, I wanted to pull out very specific products that we have seen that I consider hot topics. One of those is NAC. So the reason I believe that this has become such a hot topic is actually because of recent regulatory actions taken by FDA. So there is a claim that NAC would fall under the drug exclusion provision that doesn't allow dietary supplements to include compounds that are out for investigation as new drugs. This was part of FSMA. However, in this case, there has been some information brought to light that NAC has been on the market for years, for decades. And so FDA actually released a draft guidance on NAC, which when finalized will explain the intent to exercise what's called enforcement discretion with respect to the sale and distribution of certain NAC products. We believe the reason that's happening is because the intent of DSHEA was never to stifle dietary supplement sales, but it was to support the money and time put behind bringing a pharmaceutical to market. So we are going to be looking for that draft guidance to explain that intent to exercise enforcement discretion as it pertains to NAC supplements. The other thing we have seen coming in with lots of questions about testing is something called NMN, or nicotinamide mononucleotide. So interestingly, there's something in your system called NAD. It is an essential cofactor in all living cells and is thought to support age-related issues. So it is shown that NAD in your system declines with age, along with a lot of other compounds in your system. And a way to support NAD would be a way to support almost an anti-aging concept. And so NMN is a natural compound that serves as an efficient NAD precursor. So we've seen a lot of questions come in about how to test this particular compound. In addition to these two, a hot topic that continues to be a hot topic are plant-based proteins. So in 2022, the market share was 12.2 billion. Consumers are interested in these types of products because they are considered more sustainable as compared to animal source proteins. And that's in regards to both personal and environmental health. Next slide, please. And so what I want to make sure we point out is as people start using new ingredients, as they want to bring products to market faster, I think it's very important to pay attention to FDA warning letters. You can almost use these as a way to make sure your quality program isn't breaking some of these same rules. So in April 2022, there was an inspection of a facility and it revealed that products were adulterated because they had been prepared or held in a manufacturing plant that did not meet cGMP requirements for dietary supplements. Now, in May of 2022, a different warning letter showed that, and Jeff had absolutely touched on this point, these people were called out for failure to establish product specifications. So for their identity, their purity, their strength and composition of their finished dietary supplement. They also failed to establish and follow laboratory control processes. So in this particular situation, they were not using, they did not include the use of criteria for selecting a standard reference material used in performing tests and examinations. So you want to make sure that you're not only testing, that your testing is fit for purpose and that the test is being used in a proper manner, and that you do have things like criteria for selecting reference materials. Next slide, please. So in addition to dietary supplements, we also see a huge trend of global natural and organic cosmetics. So this market is growing. During the pandemic, there was a shift in consumer preferences, so more people were looking for clean labeled and functional skincare products alongside the clean label and functional supplement. So it is the millennials who are leading the trend toward this healthy and clean product. And it was the ability to increase online consumer reach, as well as have these products trending in luxury personal care available on shelves. So with these two, what you see now is an increase from 32 billion in 2022 to an estimated 50 billion in just 5 years, which is incredible growth for the organic cosmetic market. Next slide, please. So just like we see these trends for specific compounds in dietary supplements, what's interesting are the way you see cosmetic trends, because it's more, what you end up seeing is a lot of requests for products to be free from something, free from compounds, free from PFAS, free from parabens, free from sulfates. So this is probably the top list of requests when it comes to testing. If you want to make a claim like free from, you need to be able to support what you're writing on your label. And so we have seen a lot of testing come through the different Eurofins laboratories requesting things like phthalates, toluene, free from EDTA. And so that's the kind of cosmetic trends we're seeing, is actually specific requests for products to be free from these chemicals. Next slide, please. Just like supplement companies, cosmetic companies do get FDA warnings. There was a recent FDA warning, this was in April of 2022, that a product was unapproved new drug and therefore misbranded. In addition to that, there was a second letter that went out in November of 2019, and it was referred to as adulterated drugs from contract manufacturers. And basically this warning came out because there was a failure to conduct component identity testing. So you do need to test those raw ingredients going into your finished product. And this group failed to test each batch for objectionable microorganisms, so for adulteration or filth. And so it is important to set up your testing programs to follow CGMPs and to assure that you are following the requirements of FDA for both supplements and cosmetics. Next slide, please. What has been really rough is over the last years, we haven't had any guidance. There's been very little movement on regulations for cosmetics. But I have good news for you, because recently there was draft guidance documents released. So FDA has issued specific guidance to industry. This is in regards to cosmetic lip products and other externally applied cosmetics, that they should not contain more than 10 parts per million lead. In addition to that, though, and what I think is incredibly helpful, is that FDA has now released a GMP guideline and inspection checklist for cosmetics, which we have not had before. If you check section 6, that's where you're going to find the laboratory controls, and that's where you're going to find how to avoid getting warning letters like the ones that I just showed you for cosmetics companies. Next slide, please. And so a lot of the key takeaways from this is that understanding current innovation and customer trends is important, especially for your companies, but you need to be sure to account for associated risks. As new ingredients become popular, that can equal contamination and fraud, especially if for products that are scarce or ingredients that are scarce. And in addition to that, using FDA warning letters is an excellent way to give your company insight on their own quality programs. And utilizing FDA regulations and guidance for industry really will help you create a more robust quality program. So now let me turn this over to Grace Bandong, who will be discussing risk-based hazard analysis, and it's a tool for building comprehensive analytical testing programs. Grace?
Hi, thanks, Mariel. And that was thanks to Jeff and Mariel for taking us through a really nice, broad oversight of all the different risks that we could possibly encounter. And for me, I will take you close up. focusing on risk-based hazards analysis, which is a tool for building comprehensive analytical testing programs, specifically focusing on chemical hazards, those contaminants that Jeff and Mariel mentioned in their while they were speaking. So just a little bit of background. In 2011, the Food Safety Modernization Act was signed into law, and what was for contaminants and chemical hazards, what was special for the enactment of that law was that it singled out and included contaminants, specifically chemical hazards. It's historically there's been always a focus on microbiological hazards, but the FSMA brought out focused chemical hazards, and then where they suggested to use risk-based hazards analysis, and then on top of that, once you identify your chemical hazards, you need to verify that you are actually mitigating or taking care of those chemical hazards, and which added requirements for the verification of ingredients and also suppliers. And connected to that is that word specifications again, the importance of specs, because that is, having specs is the one that allows you to gauge your ingredients, to gauge your products, and to gauge what you're going to do if you find or come across chemical hazards in your products. And I'm just going to reiterate what Jeff said earlier, that with all the growth happening and all the changes, there is always risks introduced. And so what is the process of recommended by the FSMA? Is there's really actually 4 steps, broken it down to 4 steps. So first we identify the hazard, then we try to control the hazard, and then we manage it throughout our production from from soil to the shelf, and then we verify that we are indeed controlling that hazard. For the 30 years that I've been working in this industry, I've come up with these 3 questions are the 3 questions that I often am asked. What do I test for? How do I test? And how often do I test? And of course, on top of all of that, we only have this much money to spend. Because you're a lucky company if you have limitless amount of money to spend on testing, and if you have the budget to play around. But that reality is often that we all have a budget to work with. And so we want to be able to a risk-based hazard analysis is a good tool to use so that you can make your budget work for you by focusing, as Jeff has mentioned earlier, on your high-risk ingredients first, and then controlling how you test depending on the risk of your ingredient. So let's go back to this. So while Mariel and Jeff gave you a general oversight on all the processes and the possibilities, I'm going to go drill down and using a plant, for example. So if you have, for example, turmeric as your plant, so you want to identify your sources of contamination. If you want to use turmeric from the ground as you plant it all the way to all the finished products that use it in the product, or just turmeric as itself, put it up on the shelf. So it starts, we can go stepwise, where we go from soil, and together with the soil and during plant growth while it's growing. And just to remember, I'm focusing on chemical hazards and chemical contaminants. So in the soil, it's usually you will have, depending on where you plant it, but as crops rotate and previous crops have already been planted in that, harvested, and now you have this vacant field or area that you're wanting to put your new plant in, there could have been leftover pesticides in the soil already, and heavy metals are always insidious. We always find heavy metals in soils, depending the levels of them just depend on the area you're planting and what industries or what other rivers or bodies of water is around that area. And for the plant growth, you introduce fertilizers, which could usually, when you're looking at them, they get get lumped into the pesticides category, your growth enhancers and all that other stuff. And then as you progress from as the plant's done growing, you harvest it, you take it out, you put it into storage, or you do some drying, put it into storage, then you start introducing molds. If the temperature, the humidity is not quite right and the container of your products not quite right, you could have molds, some bacteria, and the pesticides will continue because the pesticides that was in the ground could have been taken up by the plant, or post-harvest, if you needed to apply pesticides, they could have been, it stays and lingers in your product. And then because there's also, you've introduced molds, then you introduce the potential problem of mycotoxins. Then as you progress from storage and then you go to processing, sometimes you want to extract the oils or some specific functional ingredient or functional moiety in that particular product you have, for example, for turmeric. Then you introduce your product to expose it to solvents. And you want to make sure that your process at the end takes care of removal of the solvent that you use to extract all this, hence the need for you expose it to residual solvents. And then the mycotoxins, when they start forming, they get carried through the process, and so do pesticides and heavy metals. And then in addition to that, as you're processing and making final products, for example, you're combining your turmeric with other, you want to put it on the shelf with other ingredients to make a capsule and add flavors, you will, if they're plant-based as well, you start introducing pesticides and heavy metals again, because it's the same process. If they're plant-based, they go through the soil and all of that stuff. And that takes them all the way to the shelf. So you could end up with pesticides and heavy metals and leftover mycotoxins. And so what you want to be able to do is you want to know and understand what your product has as far as these contaminants are concerned. And that to do that is testing. Testing is often necessary because that's the only, one of the ways that I know for you to figure out what the contaminants or chemicals that you have in your products. And I copied this little picture from Jeff, but I just changed it into your suppliers, your ingredients, and your practices is that circle of your risk for chemical hazards. And this is this other question that I often get asked. Do we have to test? There's really no law that directly tells you you must test for pesticides or you must test for heavy metals. There is none. However, in the CFR, the section of 342, adulterated food, if you can all see that, section 342 says that an ag commodity or processed food or feed is deemed adulterated and subject to enforcement if it contains either a pesticide that's not allowed in the product, or it exceeds the tolerance that's established for that, or a food additive regulation as well. And also, if you have, so if you find a pesticide, this is just an example, there are different other lines in that section that covers heavy metals and covers micro, and so they all fall into that word adulterated, which you heard Mariel and Jeff bring up for all this risk that you're looking at, adulteration. It all boils down to adulteration. And also for the dietary supplement world especially, the SHEA tells us that manufacturers and distributors of dietary supplements are prohibited from marketing products that are adulterated or misbranded. So if you are putting something out there that, because if you imagine you're putting out a supplement that's supposed to be good for you, for your health, but then within that, as they're taking that supplement, they're also taking a dose of lead or a dose of arsenic. That would not be very good for our consumers. So that was a very quick coverage for chemical risk. There's a whole process that you can go through identifying your risk factors and putting them all together so that in the end, as Jeff mentioned earlier, you can identify which of your ingredients are high risk as far as containing chemicals or the potential for having chemicals in there, or medium risk or low risk. So you want, and if you have a limited budget, you focus your testing, and so you can have your baseline on the high risk ingredients. And also when you do the chemical risk assessment, that's when you can use or formulate some of your specs for chemicals and for the chemical hazards. Because if you are looking at pesticides, you can base it on you don't want any pesticides at all, or you want the pesticides to be under what's allowed for that particular ingredient. So in conclusion for all this, echoing what Jeff had said earlier, use a risk-based approach to plant-based ingredients and understand your likely contaminants and adulterants. Basically know your products, what's in there and what's the potential of them being in there, and develop specifications for contaminants based on risk. Because if you do that, it will help you balance the need for compliance, safety, and economics. Using it risk-based, again, allows you to balance all those three. And understand your source of ingredients. I didn't speak a lot about this, but across the globe, there are many different regulations for example, for pesticides, and pesticides that may be allowed in South America, for example, may not be allowed in the US or in the EU, or vice versa. So there's a difference in regulations. So understand where your ingredients are coming from. And then finally, know your suppliers. Always have a good relationship with your suppliers. And with that, that will be the end of all our presentations. And thank you for listening to us.
Thank you so much for the presentations. We will move into a brief Q&A. We have had several questions come into the chat. So I think the first one here, I will ask Marielle this question. What kind of information will I find in the new
Sorry, Amy, you cut out there. Do you mind repeating that question?
Oh, certainly, Marielle. The question that came in posed to you is, what kind of information will I find in the new cosmetics guidance from FDA?
Oh, absolutely. So it is a checklist that was designed to help cosmetic manufacturers understand what FDA would be looking for in the instance that they showed up at 9 a.m. on a Monday in order to do an inspection. And so what we're really looking at here are things like laboratory controls. So the idea that testing raw materials, testing in-process samples, and testing finished products needs to be completed to verify things like their identity and determine compliance with their specifications developed for that company. They're going to be looking for things like reserved samples of approved lots or batches. They're going to make sure that you're testing things like the water supply that's being used to create these products. In addition, what you're going to see is a way to help you understand and have a checklist to inspect your own manufacturing facilities, or to help you inspect those of your suppliers. So that's just the beginning of that checklist.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marielle. And then the next question here is, where can I find current and previous warning letters sent by the FDA?
Absolutely. So those are going to be on the FDA website, which is fda.gov. And actually, there's a way for you to sign up to receive letters as they go out. So you get an announcement that new letters have been sent up or set out, and you're actually able to search them either by company or by the office that is sending them out. And so it really is a great way to stay up to date with what FDA is looking for during inspections.
Wonderful, thank you. And then just about like 2 or 3 more questions here based on the timing and looking at the audience here. The next question that came in is, what are the heavy metals of concern on plant-based dietary supplements or cosmetics?
Well, there's usually 4. I call them the big 4 or the holy 4, which is lead, cadmium, arsenic, and mercury. And of course, for other areas, there are additional elements that you would have to add. For example, well, for cosmetics, you may have to add nickel or selenium for those, for the list of heavy metals that you do.
Wonderful, thank you, Grace. Next question here, are methods used for testing of heavy metals, pesticides the same for plant-based cosmetics and dietary supplements?
No. Usually the methods are if you're doing dietary supplements, if you validated a method for dietary supplements, you can't just switch that over to cosmetics because of the different ingredients and the different, sometimes moisture content, fat content, and just general composition. So you'd have to do a suitability of your existing method and do either a full validation or a verification that your method works.
Great, thank you. And I think we have time for one more question here. Are there any resources for ingredient qualification or qualifying suppliers of ingredients?
Yeah, I'll take that one. There is a nice document out there from CD, which is SIDI, the Standardized Information on Dietary Ingredients. It's about a 50-page document, and it covers ingredient supplier and supplier qualification. It covers a lot of things like we've been talking about, risk assessments. It talks about frequency of tests when you're dealing with high risk ingredients versus low risk ingredients. So obviously there may be a different protocol that you would use to test those types of ingredients. So I would just encourage you to look that up. Sorry, I don't have that on my slide. There is you can find that on the internet. Again, it's Standardized Information on Dietary Ingredients under Ingredient Supplier Qualification.
Great, thank you for that, Jeff. And I think that will wrap up our Q&A session today. Again, if we have received any questions that we somehow have missed in the chat, we will follow up with you offline after the presentation to answer all of those questions. But again, I want to thank everyone for attending today. I want to remind you that you will receive a copy of the webinar recording along with the slides within 3 business days. And thank you again to all of our presenters today and everyone for attending. Have a great rest of your day.